Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Today in Pakistan is Kashmir Solidarity Day, so it seemed like an appropriate time to review the situation in occupied Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, that is. We currently have a number of statistics that I want to run through. In fact, 900,000 Indian occupation forces in that territory. It is the most densely militarized zone and the largest quote-unquote prison in the world, open-air prison, if we think about it in those terms. We've had 8,000 plus unidentified mass graves that have been found over these years. We've also had, in fact, the use of chemical weapons to a certain extent, where 37 Kashmiris have been burnt alive, while their bodies, were completely beyond recognition when they were found. We've also had rapes and molestations of women, especially, of course, in Kashmir, around 4,000 approximately, even minor victims also through these years. Also, the biggest thing, of course, that has happened of recent is the abrogation of Article 370, the attempt to then change the demographics of the territory also in favor of course, of mainland Indians as well. There's a lot to discuss, but I want to get to our guests earlier rather than later and have their take on the situation in Kashmir as we speak. We're joined now by Fantina, who is an activist, journalist, and author. He's joining us this morning from Ontario, Canada. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Nouf Bazaz, who is a clinical assistant professor at Loyola University, Maryland. Nouf and Robert, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Nouf, let me start with you, if I may. There's certainly a lot that can be discussed, right? But at this point in time, what do you think is the most important issue when we're discussing Kashmir? Is it, do you think, still very much the issue of Article 370 and the status of the territory?
So, the revocation of Article 370 was just one step as a part of this, wider shift towards demographic change. And I think the important thing to keep in mind right now is that we have a decades-long protracted military occupation. And now, in this past year, especially, we're really seeing the worst nightmares of Kashmiris being realized as their land is being given away, as, their forests are being cut down. The human rights violations are obviously only just being ramped up, but all towards this greater goal of settler colonialism and of just changing the demographic population by replacing the indigenous Kashmiris there with Indians. And so we're seeing that happening at just an absolute rapid pace.
Robert, Pakistan has brought up this issue many times in international fora. What do you make of the international community's reaction or lack of when it comes to these sorts of things? I mean, there was, of course, a reaction to Article 370's revocation, but it's not like this is a completely new issue when it comes to Kashmir. As Nouf there said, this has been, decades in the making.
Yes, it has been. And the international community has once again shunned its duty and ignored the suffering of the Kashmiri people. This, as you say, has been ongoing for decades, but has in the last year and a half intensified to a brutal and just unspeakably brutal condition where the Indian army is destroying the Kashmiri people, or attempting to destroy the Kashmiri people. This is genocide, and it's being ignored. The goal of India is to remove the Kashmiri people, to destroy their culture, to oppress them, and pretend that they do not exist, which is a violation of countless international laws, violation of the basic human rights of the Kashmiri people. The international community, through the United Nations and through individual countries themselves, needs to act and has shirked that duty for decades, but most especially since August of 2019. The fact that some comments were made initially condemning the revocation of the various constitutional articles that gave some semblance of autonomy to Kashmir, and the fact that those condemnations have not resulted in anything but empty words is shocking and extremely tragic for the people of Kashmir.
Yeah. If I want to just hone in on, one example of the victimization of the Kashmiri peoples and talk about the way the women are treated within the territory, right? So I mentioned in my introduction, of course, rapes and molestations of women, including minors, mind you, of both genders. But then there's also this issue of half widows, right? And, I've watched documentary upon documentary about the 8 to 10,000 Kashmiris who are in enforced disappearance right now, and around 2,500 women, if I'm not mistaken, are currently half widows in the territory. How devastating is that for Kashmiri society?
Oh, it's absolutely devastating. I've interviewed and I've sat with many of these women, and the stories are just absolutely harrowing. I mean, it's, women whose husbands were disappeared and, just literally, when they went out during the day to pay a bill or to run an errand, and they were never seen again. The women that I was speaking to in particular happened to be pregnant actually at the time, and talked about just the impact and the effect that had on them. And it's something that stays with you forever. I was sitting with women where, it was either their husbands or their sons had disappeared, sometimes decades ago, and they still held that hope. That one day they could return. And clinically, we talk a lot. We talk about that in terms of this like disenfranchised grief, this grief which can never really be resolved, or you're constantly waiting, and you're like the effects of that injustice are so long lasting in terms of your ability to provide for your family, the place that you have in your own community, and so really the stories are honestly just so harrowing. And I think that, in the same breath, though, that we talk about half widows and that we talk about all of the Kashmiri women who have been so dispossessed and just so violated, it's also important to recognize, though, the role that Kashmiri women have played in the resistance. Really, women of all ages have been resisting for decades. And, oftentimes they've been at the forefront of this movement. And of course, the Indian government, their narrative is only to look at Kashmiri women as victims, while ironically, they're just, furthering this victimization. But again, Kashmiri women are more than victims. They're also resisting all of these injustices.
About resistance, Robert, it's always interesting, right, when we're viewing even the occupation, for example, in Palestine, and the way occupied peoples are spoken about. The fact that they resist is always spoken about in very negative terms. I mean, what do you think of that in the context of Kashmir as well, where any resistance on the part of the Kashmiri people is always seen as militancy or a negative thing? I mean, do these people not have a right to defend themselves?
They certainly have a right to defend themselves, but the power elite does not want to grant them that. It wants to show them as terrorists, as people who are resisting their government, which they are not, because it's not their government that has imposed all these horrific restrictions upon them. It wasn't their government that revoked Articles 370 and 35A. These are people who are freedom fighters and who are fighting for their nation and their identity. But India, which does the same thing that the United States does and that Israel does, it portrays anyone who resists their oppression as a terrorist, as an insurgent, as a criminal. The world has to recognize that this is not the case, that these are people who are and have been for decades severely repressed. All they want is what the United Nations has promised them decades and decades ago, and that is self-determination, which is something that every person in the world is entitled to. Some nations, such as the United States, will pay lip service to supporting this anywhere, but they don't in actuality do it. They do the opposite. India now is doing the exact opposite. A recent statement by an Indian, I believe it was the foreign minister, in critical of Pakistan, said that there will be no discussions between Pakistan and India because the Kashmiri situation is an internal situation, and those people are entitled to self-determination. And everything they're doing contradicts that completely. They're doing everything possible to prevent the Kashmiris from deciding their own future.
Nouf, I've brought up the example of Israel-Palestine because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel that there is a connection there, right, where these two learn lessons from each other in their respective occupations. I mean, is that fair to say, do you think, that, for example, if we're looking at the laws that are in place in a place like Kashmir, I mean, there's a special laws just for that territory where police and law enforcement have more powers than they would have normally in mainland India to suppress, I mean, if we're completely honest.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that connection has really been very well verified and substantiated at this point. I mean, even just the basic situation of having land that is being dispossessed. Even just recently, I was looking at some of the interviews of Kashmiri nomads where their temporary structures or their homes were being destroyed, and it was so hard not to see those parallels of thinking of all of the different Palestinian homes who have also been destroyed. And so, on that day-to-day basis, there's so many similarities. But then, even just on this, when you take this wider look, you see the established relationships between Israel and India and the different ways in which they're very openly talking about, sharing strategies, dealing arms. The U.S. and Israel are, of course, two of the places that are dealing arms to India for them to use in their occupation. India and Israel, they've met and they've even discussed different ways in which they can apply that same model to the Kashmir situation. So it's something that we see in terms of some of the daily realities and injustices, but again, on this wider framework.
I mean, Robert, going back then to that connection between these two, and then, of course, as Nouf correctly said, the U.S. has a huge role to play here as well, right, where it's allowing for these occupations because it certainly has the influence over both of these entities to be able to, seemingly at least, control the situation to an extent, if it's so wished, by withholding weaponry or intelligence or whatever it may be, or political clout. Is that likely to happen at any point? I mean, we've had a lot of pressure. We did have at one point in time, again, like I said, when Article 370 was revoked, international pressure on the Indian government, but that seems to have dissipated quite quickly, a lot like when it comes to Israel-Palestine, isn't it?
Yes, the parallels are striking, really. And you mentioned that the United States allows Israel, for example, to continue the oppression of the Palestinian people. It not only allows it, it finances it. By providing $4 billion in aid to Israel every year. And it could stop that today if it simply cut off the aid. Same is true with India and the situation in Kashmir. India wants to have good relationships, a good relationship with the United States, wants to continue to trade with the United States, and is susceptible to pressure from the U.S. But the U.S. will not pressure India in any major way. It may issue a statement now and then condemning Indian violence against the Kashmiris, but it will not do anything substantive because it doesn't want to disrupt trade. It wants to maintain its power in the world, and it wants to maintain the profits that it gets from being in the powerful position that it's in. And by attacking, and I don't mean physically attacking, but verbally condemning India for its violations of human rights, violations of international law, then it would possibly reduce the trade between the two nations, and this would negatively impact profits. And that's what the United States is all about, power and profits, not about international law and human rights.
Profits, Nouf. It's interesting, right? Both Israel and India tell their respective occupied peoples, such as the Kashmiris/Palestinians, that, listen, if you were to just stop resisting, we would make your life that much better, and I'm speaking in economic terms, right? So, for example, in the Middle East peace plan, quote unquote, that the Americans had presented, the Palestinians were to get, hordes of money as investment. And even the Indians have said that, when it comes to the opening up, as they call it, at least in their terms, of Kashmir to the rest of mainland India and the world, that would open up great economic opportunities for Kashmiris. So then why resist that? I mean, if I may play devil's advocate for a moment.
Absolutely. And exactly like you said, the abrogation was sold to us, in this idea of, it's really going to increase development. It's going to increase the infrastructure, the economy. And there's a few points to that. One is, okay, just take a look at India. in India, we're seeing some of the greatest discrepancy between the rich and the poor, and that's the same thing that's going to happen in Kashmir. What happens in places like this is that the resources that are there, the land that is there, and the opportunities that are there, they're not going to be developed for Kashmiris and with Kashmiris. They are going to be developed for Indians, and in regard, much of it is going to be for Indian elites. Indian elites who can buy up land, create these walled off settlements that are only available for themselves. Meanwhile, while siphoning off the resources, natural and otherwise, from the Kashmiris in order to fuel this. And so we know that when they talk about development, that's not development for Kashmiris and with Kashmiris. It's development that only serves Indian interests, and in particular, elite Indian interests.
I'll have to leave it there at that, as the clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both Nouf and Robert for joining us this morning. Robert speaking to us from Ontario, Canada, and Nouf was speaking to us from Washington, D.C. this morning, sharing their expertise with us about the latest situation when it comes to Indian-occupied Kashmir. Certainly quite a dire situation there, and the parallels between the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian lands as well as the Indian occupation then of Kashmiri lands is quite striking, as both of our guests are also mentioned. The numbers and statistics speak for themselves about how women are raped and molested, half widows, again, is a unique situation, a fairly unique situation to Kashmiris, and a whole host of other issues that we can possibly discuss. Also, the biggest of which is the recent attempt to demographically change the makeup of Kashmir as a whole. Will India succeed in that regard? The world seems to be turning a fairly blind eye to that situation, as Robert there unfortunately mentioned as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a University of Bath study, partly that is conducted by the University of Bath, about Israel's 13-year air, land and sea blockade of the Gaza Strip. The study says, and I'm quoting it now, that is the dominant factor, in worsening the humanitarian situation in the territory, resulting in ill preparedness of the local healthcare system, economy and communities to cope, end quote. And this is all specifically, of course, in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, there is no doubt, and we've spoken about this before a number of times on this show, that the Gaza Strip's healthcare system has always really been on the brink and on the edge, but the pandemic has only made things significantly worse. And the fact that the blockade still very much continues has, of course, already made that situation worse than it needed to be. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Yousef at Helou, who is a political analyst and journalist, joining us today from London. Joining us today from Amman is Daoud Kuttab, who is the Community Media Network Director. Daoud and Yousef, thank you very much for both of you for joining us today. Daoud, let me start with you. No surprises here, certainly, but what is the Israeli role, or responsibility, I should say, in fact, in how bad things are in the Gaza Strip right now in the context, again, of the pandemic?
Well, the Israelis claimed initially that when they withdrew their troops and the settlers from the Gaza Strip that the occupation had ended. And it was clear from day one that the occupation never ended, because Israel might have redeployed from the center of Gaza, but they have a very strong control over the borders. And then they started the siege after Hamas took over the power in Gaza. And they kept on saying, we will put Gaza on a diet. They will not die, but they will be on a diet, which was so inhumane the way they framed it. So they've carried out a very long siege that is totally illegal according to international law, yet nobody has made them pay politically for what they've done. And the pandemic, as you said, made things even worse.
I know, I'm sure you do have friends and family back in Gaza yourself too. What are they saying about how bad things are right now? What are your thoughts about what the blockade adds as a challenge to the pandemic?
Well, everybody knows that Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison, and Israel controls what goes in, what comes out, and the situation is still miserable. People somehow they got used to this situation because they lost faith in the so-called international community, and they're left alone to adjust with the daily hardships. So people there, if you ask them how the situation, they will tell you it's dead. I mean, there is no life. They cannot plan for the future. They cannot travel. And also, let's not also forget that Gaza's only access point to the outside world is Egypt, and Egypt closes the Rafah border crossing quite often, and it only opens the crossing few days a month or and so on. So what Gaza is being subjected to, it's collective punishment in order to force the population of Gaza to accept some certain Israeli conditions. People, they experience power cuts, a shortage of drinking healthy water, unemployment, poverty rate is very high. And now with this pandemic, the situation is going from bad to worse. And we know the health sector is already collapsed under an ongoing 13 years old siege. So overall, the people of Gaza, it's a ticking bomb. Around 2 million people live in this spot, which is very crowded, highly populated, under the age of more than 50% of the population under the age of 20. So overall, Gaza still experiences a very harsh situation.
All right, so Daoud, if we're completely honest, it's not like it's just an Israeli blockade, right? It's almost like an Israeli-Egyptian blockade, with both of those entities cooperating in this regard. Do you think that, for example, the Egyptians should be doing more to support Gaza at this very difficult time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Egyptians have their problems with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and they've had problems in Sinai. So they have inaccurately put all the blame on Hamas and Gaza, even though it has been clear that they have their own problems in Sinai. It has nothing to do with Gaza. But Gazans were the scapegoat to justify the killings and the attacks that the Egyptian army is facing in the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians also are cooperating quite closely with the Israelis on the issue of allowing the import of products, because the Israelis say there are products that have multi-use. And so if you're bringing fertilizers, they're saying, well, fertilizers are good for planting, but they also can be used some kind of weapon against the Israelis and so on. So it's been very difficult to bring in many things that the Egyptians have refused to allow, because they also consider the border not to be an international border. And the international observers that used to exist on the borders were kicked out. And now it's between Israel and Egypt to keep this unethical and illegal siege and blockade continuing for a long time.
Yousef, for me at least, it seems illogical, right? That, and of course, Gaza's always been in a very bad situation. No one's doubting that. But then within the pandemic, of course, logically, things have gotten a lot worse. So, I mean, it's not a good thing, I would think, for the Egyptians or the Israelis to have such a situation right at their respective borders.
Yes, exactly. Well, Israel prides itself as to be the first country in the world to vaccinated around 30-40% of the population so far, whereas next door, only a few kilometers away to the south in Gaza, the situation is totally miserable. It's like a difference between hell and paradise. So this hypocrisy, this conspiracy of silence on part of the international community is very shameful. Whether it's from Arab neighbors, whether it's from Israel, that it claims to be a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. And so Gaza is being blackmailed. Gaza is being extorted by the Israelis in return for calm or a total halt of resistance. For example, the Israelis conditioned the shipment of these medical supplies to Gaza on certain conditions, that the people of Gaza, they have to accept this reality of occupation, of suppression, of oppression, and Israel will, in return, will transfer some food trucks or some petrol or some electricity and water and so on. So the blackmailing policy, the extortion policy, unfortunately, it is working, because the population of Gaza have been experiencing a humanitarian situation for the past 13 or maybe 15 years now. And but the thing is that the people of Gaza, they refuse to accept this kind of dictation because they say we are a free nation. We have been resisting the occupation, with all means available. And it's because Hamas has been ruling Gaza that are being collectively punished. Obviously, not, more than half of the population or 2/3 of the population are not Hamas supporters, but they're being collectively punished.
Yeah.
And this is something is being rejected widely.
Daoud, I wonder, what are your thoughts about, if I may for a moment talk about internal Palestinian politics? Because, Mahmoud Abbas has called for new Palestinian elections. I read a couple of reports today saying that, and we know this is logical and reasonable, certainly, to say that unity amongst all Palestinian factions, in a properly elected government would be key to strengthening the hands of Palestinians just generally, anyhow. Do you think that is likely to happen? Will that actually have some sort of a real world effect, for example, on how the pandemic is dealt with in a place like Gaza?
I hope that the May 22nd legislative elections will remove one of the major excuses that Israel has used to keep the blockade on. If there is national elections in which Hamas and others participate, and out of that comes some type of a national unity government that all are represented, then Israel, I think, will have a very hard explanation for keeping the blockade, because one of the points of the initial agreement between Hamas and Fatah was the rebuilding of Gaza and the free transfer of people and goods between Gaza and the West Bank. And so for this to happen, Israel has to allow first, obviously, the elections, because they might do things to sabotage the elections, but also to accept the results of the elections. At the present time, we are all awaiting a 3-day conference in Cairo that will begin Monday, in which all the Palestinian factions and independents are going to participate. And they will try to work out some of the logistical problems and some of the issues of the elections court and the security around safeguarding a free and fair elections. So yes, I think when there is elections, and if a national unity government is created that will unify Gaza and the West Bank under one law, one legal system, one government, I think the blockade will have no justification to continue.
All right, the clock has gotten the best of us. We're going to have to leave there as our final comment. We appreciate both Yousef and Daoud speaking to us from London and Amman, respectively, sharing their insight with us about this University of Bath study. As I said, looking into the effect of the Israeli 13-year blockade on Gaza, specifically, of course, in the context of the pandemic, how bad the healthcare system there is doing. It's always done badly, of course, within the context of the blockade as it stands and as it has stood for the past 13 years. But currently, of course, the situation is significantly dire, and we keep saying, of course, that Gaza is just on the brink of collapse, i.e. the healthcare system is just on the brink of collapse. It's always been on the brink in some ways, hasn't it? That's just how people there have been living life, as Yousef there said, for so many years. How much longer can this continue? Will Palestinian unity help? If Palestinian unity does occur after the elections on May 22nd, will that mean that the Israelis will lose the excuse and will have to lift the blockade? All open-ended questions at this point in time. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UN's highest court, the International Court of Justice, which has ruled that it does have jurisdiction over a case that Iran has brought against the United States. Now, this case was brought against the U.S. during the tenure of Donald Trump, especially, of course, when he walked away from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Iran saying that the reimposition of sanctions by the U.S. went against a 1955 treaty of amity or friendship between the two nations. Now, the U.S. walked away from that treaty as well under Donald Trump. Nevertheless, the court said it does have jurisdiction over this case because of that very treaty that had been signed even before the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran. Let's discuss that a bit further. And I'm joined by Yousef Azizi, who is a research analyst in U.S. foreign policy decision-making, and he's also a PhD candidate in public administration at Virginia Tech. He's joining us this morning from Arlington, Virginia. Yousef, good morning, and thank you for joining us. What do you make of the ICJ ruling? Is it a significant win, do you think, for Iran?
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. So, yeah, it is, I can say, that symbolic victory. It is a legal victory for Iran, as Iran had in previous years during the Trump administration, international institution. it is a sign that Iran always on the right side of the legal issues in nuclear activity and nuclear disputes between Western countries and Iran during the past years. But on the other hand, as I said, it is just a symbolic issue. So a final decision is likely to take several years, and also there is no enforcement to, force the final decision on United States or other countries. So it is good for the future negotiation between Iran and United States or other parties in the JCPOA, but it's not something very significant that practically could change any economic or other situation for Iran.
So then, Yousef, if we're completely honest, Iran doesn't have that many options, does it, at this point? I mean, what options does it have, for example, if the Biden administration tells it, okay, we want to renegotiate the deal? I mean, does Iran have a plan B?
As you said, I think that the Biden administration doesn't have any urgency, doesn't see any urgency to come back to the JCPOA. They might want to, use the leverage, use what Trump administration did against Iran in the past 4 years as a leverage to, renegotiate it or go through the JCPOA 2, JCPOA Plus, and include other issues like regional security to the new negotiation. But you know that also Iranian parliament recently passed a law that suspends some of the United Nations, IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency inspection about Iran nuclear activity, and also enforce the government, the administration, Rouhani administration, to improve and boost the nuclear activity, the uranium enrichment, to regain and revive the Fordo facility to do the enrichment. So I mean that Iranian wants to show that if United States and Biden administration if they don't quickly return to the original JCPOA, so Iranian also would return to the level of nuclear activity beyond the 2015, 2013, when the negotiation started in Obama administration. So Iranian has some cards in their hand, strategic cards, but as you said, there is a negotiation between two countries. So each country wants the other side to move the first step, but Iranian recently, Jawad Zarif, the Prime Minister of Iran, asked the European Union to, come inside and, do some work here that maybe they could plan for a step-to-step plan to back to the full compliance by both countries.
We're also now joined by Dr. Farhang Jahanpour, who is a former professor and dean of the University of Isfahan. He's also a former senior research scholar at Harvard. He's taught at Cambridge and Oxford universities. He was also editor for Middle East and North Africa at BBC Monitoring from 1979 to 2001. He's joining us today from Caversham in the UK. Farhang, as always, we appreciate your joining us. What do you make of the ICJ ruling that it has jurisdiction, Farhang? How much of a real-world effect can its ruling even have? I mean, it's not really a binding ruling, even if it were to rule in favor of Iran, right?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'm a former editor for Middle East, North Africa. I retired many years ago. So I speak completely for myself and not represent any organization. As you know, yesterday, President Biden gave his first major foreign policy speech, which was in many ways very welcome. He said that America was back. The question remains which America was back. He explained it that we must start with diplomacy rooted in America's most cherished democratic values, defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity. I think this is a welcome return to the rule of law, because sometimes people refer to a rules-based international order. That depends whose rules you are talking about. But the rule of law is what it should be, returning to the UN and International Human Rights Charter and living by those agreements. The International Court of Justice, which is the supreme international court, has, in fact, already in the past, in 2018, after Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, ruled that the United States had to lift all the sanctions. America ignored it. Now, if you are going to return to the rule of law, I think the first thing America should do is to lift the illegal sanctions, which, in contradiction of Security Council 2231, were imposed on Iran. And then if they wish to talk to Iran on other issues, they are welcome. But Iran cannot renegotiate the deal anytime that America violates a previous deal.
Okay. Yousef, I wonder, and there's huge internal domestic politics as a context here, right? Because the Rouhani administration is on its way out, fairly soon this year, and there will be new elections. Do you think that will make a huge impact on what may happen next when it comes to any revival of the deal?
So from Iranian side, I think Iranian always clear about the rights in international relation, besides any government or administration will take the office in Iran. So we know that the secret talk between Obama and Iran, it's 8 years after the second term of Obama. It's right this time in 8 years, when this is the last months of President Ahmadinejad in Iran. So the secret talk in Oman will happen between the United States and Iran. And at that time, nobody knows who will become the next president in Iran. So we know that, the United States always calculate what's happening in Iran, what's become the next president or next administration. Because, as you know, the American always said that the nuclear agreement and nuclear negotiation is just the first step to build on up for other negotiation over the regional security. So they think that, if we have an administration in Tehran who are more aligned to, talk to Western about the regional issues, it is better for United States. But on the Iranian side, I think decision makers always would be, right, that, okay, we need first to see the trust between Iran and United States. If United States can comply with its obligation under JCPOA over time, and we see the benefit of that, okay, we can then go to talk about other issues. But now, when you violate everything, when the domestic politics of the United States could affect any international norm, it's not just Iran, it is about the Paris Agreement, it's about other issues, NATO, European countries. So in this situation, talking about other issues is not safe.
Farhang, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What do you think happens next, right? Biden's given this speech. Many people have lauded it for many reasons when it comes to foreign policy, but he has many, many handicaps, right? I mean, he himself is, of course, very supportive of Israel itself. And of course, if Israel says that it doesn't want the deal to occur, it can bring significant amounts of pressure upon the Biden administration in order for that not to happen, right?
Well, there is a difference between being a supporter of Israel. Many countries in the West are, and I think probably rightly so, but being totally under the spell of Israeli foreign policy. Israel has its own priorities on foreign policy. The United States, as a great superpower, should have its own. To try to tie U.S.'s hands because of certain statements from Israel would be very wrong, I think, both for Israel and for the United States. The Arab-Israeli conflict is one which needs to be sorted out, but it should not overshadow everything which America wants to do. Return to the rule of law means that the country which violated an agreement must return to it. It was very irresponsible, I think, of Israeli official who said that if America returns, Israel will attack Iran. This is totally unacceptable according to international law. I think President Biden should really turn a new page and return America to the rule of law, because this will be, in that case, will have a strong point against Russia and other countries. But if it is the first one to violate international law and the agreement which it signed, which, as Mr. Azizi said, took many years to sign, then I think it really cannot expect other countries to return to the rule of law.
Very well. There at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Farhang and Yousef speaking to us from the US and the UK respectively, sharing their expertise with us upon the latest of where, US-Iran relations, again, within the context of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal stand. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruling in favor of Iran, saying that it does have jurisdiction over the Iranian case that was brought to the court against the Trump decision to walk away from the nuclear deal and then to reimpose harsh sanctions on the country. On the ground, though, as Yousef said earlier, there may not be much of a change, even if a couple of years down the road or more years down the road, the court were to rule in favor of Iran. Its rulings are not binding in any way, shape, or form. It cannot actually do anything on the ground to enforce them. So then this, again, just seems symbolic at this point. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that Iran doesn't have any weapons in its arsenal, so to speak, figuratively, to hold the U.S. to account. As Farhang there mentioned twice, the rule of law is extremely important for any good relations between two nations, especially nations which are adversaries in the fashion that the U.S. and Iran are. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.